On January 23rd, 2026, something happened that Wall Street said was impossible. Silver crossed $100 an ounce. For the first time in recorded history, an ounce of the world's oldest money cost more than a barrel of oil, more than a day's wages for most Americans, more than anyone alive had ever seen. Financial analysts scrambled for explanations. China had just restricted exports. Warehouses were running empty. Solar panels and electric vehicles were consuming supply faster than mines could dig it out of the ground. But those are just the proximate causes. The real story goes back 6,000 years. And it's not a story of supply and demand. It's a story of crime. Every empire that ever tried to cheat silver eventually paid the price. Rome debased its coins until inflation destroyed the economy. Spain drowned in silver while going bankrupt 6 times. Britain fought wars to steal it back from China. American bankers manipulated it for decades until federal prosecutors put them in prison. And through it all, the receipts were kept. Tonight, we trace the complete paper trail of humanity's most manipulated metal. From the first silver smelted in ancient Anatolia, to the slaves who died by the millions in Spanish mines, to the JPMorgan traders who finally faced justice in 2023. The receipts tell a story that textbooks don't. They tried to bury it. We dug it up. Let's start at the beginning. Somewhere around 4000 BCE, in what is now central Turkey, a metalworker made a discovery that would shape the next 6,000 years of human civilization. He was processing lead ore, standard practice for the Bronze Age, but when he heated the ore to extreme temperatures in an oxidizing atmosphere, something unexpected happened. The lead absorbed into the ceramic vessel and left behind a shimmering white metal, silver. The process was called cupellation. Heat the ore to nearly 1,000 degrees Celsius. Let the lead oxidize and soak into the porous clay. What remains is almost pure silver. At Arslan Tepe in eastern Turkey, archaeologists found graves from the late 4th millennium BCE, filled with silver artifacts. The Bolkarda mining district shows evidence of over 850 ancient mines. By 2500 BCE, Chaldean metalworkers had refined the process so precisely that their kupal beads still survive in the Ankara Museum. But here's what the history books often miss. Silver wasn't just discovered, it was chosen. Gold was already known. Gold was beautiful. Gold was rare. Gold was for kings, but gold was too rare, too valuable. You couldn't pay a worker in gold. You couldn't buy bread with gold. A single gold coin might represent a year's wages. Silver was different. Silver was abundant enough to circulate, valuable enough to matter, divisible enough to make change, durable enough to last generations. Gold was the metal of gods. Silver became the money of men. By 2800 BCE, the Sumerians had turned silver into something revolutionary, not coins. Those wouldn't come for another 2,000 years. Something more fundamental, a standard. Silver rings and coils weighing precisely 8 to 10 grams circulated throughout Mesopotamia as the world's first standardized currency. You didn't need a king's face stamped on metal. You just needed a scale and a reputation for honest weights. The silver shekel emerged around 2150 BCE under Naram Sin of Akkad. The word itself, shekel, comes from the Akkadian shiklu, meaning to weigh and to pay. Same word, same concept. Money was weight. Honest weight was honest money. When Hammurabi codified his famous laws around 1755 BCE, silver was the standard of value throughout. A slave who helped another slave escape? 2 silver shekels reward for returning him. A physician who saved a nobleman's life through surgery? 10 silver shekels. A builder who constructed a house? 2 shekels per unit of surface area, a year's wages for an unskilled laborer, about 10 shekels total. But Hammurabi understood something essential. 8 separate provisions in his code address one specific crime: tampering with scales. The ancients knew that whoever controlled the measure controlled the money, and whoever controlled the money controlled everything. This lesson would be forgotten and relearned countless times over the next 4,000 years, always at tremendous cost. 50 kilometers south of Athens, the hills of Lorien held a secret: silver, massive deposits of silver ore threaded through limestone and marble waiting to be extracted. The Greeks had known about Lorien for centuries. Small-scale mining dated back to 3000 BCE, but in 483 BCE, miners struck something extraordinary. A vein so rich, so concentrated, that it would change the course of Western civilization. The Athenian assembly faced a choice. The traditional practice was to divide windfalls among citizens. Each Athenian would receive about 10 drachmas. Walking around money, a nice bonus. But a politician named Themistocles had a different idea. Persia was coming. Everyone knew it. King Xerxes was assembling the largest invasion force the ancient world had ever seen, and Athens had no navy to speak of. Themistocles proposed using the silver windfall, about 100 talents, roughly 2.6 tons, to build 200 warships, triremes, fast, maneuverable, and deadly. His rival Aristides argued for distribution. The people deserved their silver. The assembly voted to ostracize Aristides. Exile, 10 years. The ships were built. On September 22nd, 480 BCE, in the narrow straits of Salamis, the Greek fleet met the Persian armada. The Persians had more ships, more men, more resources. But the Greeks had those 200 triremes, silver-funded ships, crewed by silver-funded sailors, fighting in waters too narrow for Persian numbers to matter. By nightfall, the Persian fleet was destroyed. Xerxes watched from a throne on the shore as his invasion collapsed. Western civilization, Greek philosophy, democracy, drama, the foundations of everything we now call Western, survived because of silver pulled from the ground by slaves. About those slaves. The historian Thucydides recorded that 20,000 slaves worked the Laurian mines at their peak. 20,000 human beings, chained, branded, working in shafts only a meter high, illuminated by nothing but oil lamps descending 50 meters into the earth. Children were used in the narrowest passages. They were small enough to fit. The average life expectancy for a Laurian slave was 4 years. 4 years of crawling through darkness, breathing rock dust, carrying ore in baskets until their bodies gave out. Then they were replaced. The mines needed bodies. Athens needed silver. The silver funded democracy for citizens and death for slaves. The silver became coins. The famous Athenian owl tetradrachm, Athena's helmeted profile on one side, her owl, symbol of wisdom, on the other, about 17 grams of silver at 95% purity. For 500 years, the design barely changed. And that was the point. In a world of debased currencies and uncertain weights, the Athenian owl was trusted. Hordes of these coins have been found in Egypt, Syria, the Levant, even India. Other kingdoms minted copies just to trade on Athens' reputation. The first trusted international currency was built on slave labor and silver. The receipts don't lie. But the story was only just beginning. When Rome introduced the denarius around 211 BCE, it was a coin worth trusting. 95% pure silver, about 4.5 grams. Enough to pay a skilled worker for a day's labor. The name itself, denarius, meant it containing 10. For the 10 smaller bronze coins it was worth. For 2 centuries, Rome maintained the standard. The denarius became the currency of an empire stretching from Britain to Babylon, from the Rhine to the Nile. And then the emperors discovered something dangerous. They discovered that nobody could tell the difference between a coin with 95% silver and one with 90%. In 64 CE, Rome burned. The Great Fire destroyed 10 of the city's 14 districts. Emperor Nero needed money to rebuild, desperately. His solution was elegant in its dishonesty. Nero reduced the denarius from 3.9 grams of silver to 3.4 grams. He added 10% base metal to the alloy. On the outside, the coins looked the same. The weight difference was barely noticeable, but Nero could now mint more coins from the same amount of silver. Instant profit. The receipts show what happened next. Each emperor who followed faced the same temptation. Wars to fund, soldiers to pay, bread and circuses to maintain, and each emperor made the same calculation. Who would notice a little less silver? Under Trajan, the denarius dropped to 85% pure. Under Marcus Aurelius, 75%. Under Septimius Severus, 50 to 60%. He doubled soldiers' pay, from 300 to 500 denarii, but paid them in coins worth half as much. Then came the innovation that broke the system. In 215 CE, Emperor Caracalla introduced a new coin. He called it the Antoninianus. We call it the double denarius. The face value was 2 denarii. The actual silver content was 1.5 denarii. Simple arithmetic. Mint a coin, call it worth 2, make it contain 1.5. Instant 50% profit on every coin. The tell was subtle but revealing. Emperors on regular denarii wore laurel wreaths. Emperors on the Antoninianus wore radiate crowns. Spiky, sun-like halos. The radiate crown became the mark of fraud. By the reign of Gallienus in the 260s, the Antoninianus contained only 2 to 5% silver. The coins were essentially bronze, with a thin silver wash that wore off almost immediately. The government was paying soldiers and suppliers with metal tokens and demanding they pretend the tokens were money. Nobody was fooled. The Mises Institute documented what happened next. Prices rose nearly 1,000% across the empire. A measure of wine that cost 1/8 of a denarius under Augustus cost 8 debased denarii by the 260s, a 6,300% increase. The gold to denarii exchange rate tells the story more starkly. Under Augustus, 1 gold aureus equaled 25 denarii. By the 260s, 1 aureus equaled 1,000 debased denarii. But the cruelest receipt was written in blood. Soldiers stopped accepting coins for payment. They demanded food, clothing, equipment, anything real. The government stopped accepting its own money for taxes. The Edict of Caracalla required tax payments in kind: grain, livestock, manufactured goods. Trade networks collapsed as merchants refused worthless currency. Cities that had thrived on commerce shrank as barter replaced money. The middle class, shopkeepers, traders, artisans, was annihilated. Their savings evaporated. Entire regions reverted to subsistence agriculture. Why sell crops for coins that bought nothing? When Constantine finally stabilized the currency around 312 CE, he did it with gold, not silver. His solidus, 4.5 grams of pure gold, would maintain its weight and purity for 700 years. But the reform saved only the rich. The poor, who had used silver and bronze coins, were left with worthless tokens. The empire's monetary system had stratified into gold for elites and garbage for everyone else. Rome's silver crime took 2 centuries to complete. The empire never recovered. Remember this pattern. We'll see it again. Debasement, inflation, collapse. The receipts are always kept. In 1545, an indigenous prospector named Diego Hualpa climbed a mountain in the high Andes. He was searching for a sacred Inca shrine. What he found would flood the world with silver and kill millions of his people. The story goes that Hualpa lit a fire on the mountainside for warmth. When dawn came, he saw something glinting in the ashes. Silver ore, veins of it running through the rock. Word reached the Spanish within months. By 1546, the rush was on. They called the mountain Cerro Rico, the rich mountain. They called the town that grew at its base Potosi. Within 60 years, it would be one of the largest cities on earth, larger than London, larger than Paris, larger than any city in the Americas. The Spanish crown granted Potosi a coat of arms in 1557. The motto read, "I am rich Potosi, treasure of the world, king of mountains and envy of kings." The indigenous people who lived and died there called it something else, the mountain that eats men. The Spanish needed labor, massive amounts of labor, more than the local population could possibly provide voluntarily. So in 1573, Viceroy Francisco de Toledo formalized a system called the mita. The concept was borrowed from the Inca, a rotating labor obligation to the state, but the Spanish perverted it into something unprecedented. 13,000 to 14,000 workers were conscripted annually from 16 Andean provinces. The catchment area covered 200,000 square miles. 1 out of every 7 adult indigenous men was forced into service. Workers traveled for months to reach Potosi. Many never returned. The work shifts lasted 12 hours. Miners descended shafts hundreds of feet deep on rickety ladders. They crawled through tunnels only a meter high. They carried loads of ore weighing 75 pounds or more in 25 trips per day. Ventilation was minimal. Temperature underground could reach the 70s Fahrenheit, stiflingly hot after the cold climb down. Light came from candles held in the mouth or strapped to foreheads. Cave-ins were common. Floods were common. Silicosis, the disease of rock dust in the lungs, was universal. And then there was the mercury. In 1554, a Spanish merchant named Bartolomé de Medina developed a new extraction method. It used mercury to bond with silver, creating an amalgam that could be heated to separate pure metal. The patio process was revolutionary. It allowed extraction from lower-grade ores that would otherwise be worthless. It dramatically increased output. It also poisoned everyone who touched it. The mercury came from Huancavelica, another Peruvian mine that the Spanish called La Mina de la Muerte, the mine of death. Spanish lawyer Juan de Solórzano visited in the early 1600s. He wrote, "The poison penetrated to the very marrow, debilitating all the members and causing a constant shaking, and the workers usually died within 4 years. 4 years. The same life expectancy as the slaves at Lorient 2,000 years earlier. At Potosi, workers mixed the mercury slurry by walking through it barefoot. They breathed the vapors. They absorbed the poison through their skin. Scientific analysis estimates that Huancavelica released 17,000 metric tons of mercury vapor between 1564 and 1810. Potosi released another 39,000 tons. Together, they accounted for more than a quarter of all mercury emissions in Latin America during the colonial period. The soil around Potosi remains contaminated to this day. How many died? The commonly cited figure is 8 million. Eduardo Galeano's influential Open Veins of Latin America popularized this number. Historians debate it. Some argue it includes all deaths across the entire viceroyalty of Peru, not just Potosi. More conservative estimates suggest over 1 million deaths directly attributable to the mines and mercury processing. The exact number matters less than the scale. Millions of human beings died so that Europe could have coins. What did all that death produce? Silver. Mountains of silver. Rivers of silver. Between 1545 and 1810, Potosi's official records show 45,000 tons of pure silver extracted. Actual production, including smuggling, may have reached 90,000 tons. At peak production in the 1590s, Potosi contributed 81% of all silver from the viceroyalty of Peru. At moments, 60% of all silver mined on Earth came from this single mountain. The silver became coins. The real de a ocho, the piece of 8, each coin weighed 27.47 grams total, with 25.6 grams of pure silver. 93% purity, about the same diameter as a modern US silver dollar, which is no coincidence. The piece of 8 became the world's first truly global currency. It circulated in Europe, Africa, the Ottoman Empire, Mughal India, and Ming China. Pirates didn't just steal pieces of 8 in movies, they stole them because pieces of 8 were money everywhere. The coin remained legal tender in the United States until 1857. The US dollar itself was modeled directly on it. The Coinage Act of 1792 defined the dollar as 371.25 grains of silver, the average weight of Spanish pieces of 8 already circulating in the new nation. Even the dollar sign. One theory suggests it evolved from the pillars of Hercules on the Spanish coin, the 2 pillars with an S-shaped banner wrapping around them. Every time you write a dollar sign, you may be tracing a symbol invented to mark silver pulled from a mountain that killed millions. Here's the cruelest receipt in our entire investigation. Spain, the nation that controlled more silver than any empire in history, went bankrupt 6 times in 90 years, 1557, 1575, 1596, 1607, 1627, 1647. The richest empire on earth couldn't pay its bills. The silver never stayed in Spain. It arrived in Seville and immediately flowed out again, to German bankers like the Fuggers, to Genoese financiers like the Grimaldi and Spinola families. The Fuggers alone held wealth estimated at 2% of Europe's entire GDP. In today's terms, that would be roughly $400 billion. They financed Charles V's election as Holy Roman Emperor in 1519 with a loan of 543,000 florins. Spain's kings borrowed against future silver shipments at interest rates of 12 to 14%. When shipments fell short of projections, as they often did, the debt spiral accelerated. Meanwhile, the flood of silver destroyed Spanish industry. Prices rose 400% over 150 years. That's about 1.2% annual inflation, catastrophic by pre-modern standards. The silver created demand for goods that Spain couldn't produce. Why manufacture textiles when you could buy them with silver? Why develop industries when you could import everything? By the late 17th century, of 84 commercial houses operating in Cadiz, Spain's main trading port, only 12 were Spanish-owned. The nation had contracted Dutch disease centuries before anyone named it. Abundant resources made productive work seem pointless. When the silver eventually ran out, nothing remained. Contemporary observers saw it clearly. The treasure from the Americas, they wrote, had created an attitude that held productive work in contempt. Spain entered the 17th century as the dominant power in Europe. It exited as a second-rate nation, serially bankrupt, its population declining, its cities shrinking. Historians call it Moctezuma's curse. The very wealth that built the empire destroyed it. But Spain's silver didn't just flow to European bankers. 1/3 of everything pulled from Potosi went east, to India, to the Philippines, and ultimately to China, the largest economy on earth, which had decided that silver was the only currency worth accepting. That decision would shape the next 3 centuries of world history. It would lead to one of the most audacious financial crimes ever committed by a nation-state. While Spain was pulling silver from Potosi and going bankrupt, the largest economy on earth was creating an insatiable demand for that silver: China. In 1580, Grand Secretary Zhang Zhuzheng implemented a reform that would reshape global trade for centuries. He called it the single whip reform. The concept was simple. Instead of paying 30 or 40 different taxes in grain, cloth, labor, and goods, Chinese subjects would pay one consolidated tax: in silver. China had invented paper money centuries earlier. The Song dynasty pioneered it, but successive governments had destroyed confidence through hyperinflation. The Yuan dynasty printed so much paper that it became worthless. The early Ming tried again and failed again. By the late 16th century, Chinese merchants and officials trusted only one thing: metal, specifically silver. The problem was geology. China has virtually no silver deposits. The mines that existed produced a trickle compared to demand, so China imported. From 1565 to 1820, Spanish galleons carried an estimated 400 million silver pesos from Mexico to Manila. Most of that silver continued on to China. The arbitrage was irresistible. In Europe, 1 ounce of gold bought 12 to 14 ounces of silver. In China, 1 ounce of gold bought only 5 to 7 ounces of silver. Silver was worth twice as much in China. 1/3 of all silver pulled from Potosi and the Mexican mines flowed east. By the early 17th century, silver imports added 20 times more bullion to Chinese coinage than domestic mines produced. Contemporary observers noted that silver had become the only important thing in the world, and all things were based on silver. China had built its economy on a metal it couldn't produce. That vulnerability would be exploited. By the late 18th century, Britain had a problem. The British were addicted to Chinese goods, tea, silk, porcelain. The average London household spent 5% of its budget on tea alone. The government collected 10% of total revenue from tea taxes. But China wanted nothing Britain made. British woolens? Inferior? British manufactured goods? Unnecessary. British silver? Yes, always silver. The trade imbalance was hemorrhaging British wealth. Year after year, silver flowed out and Chinese goods flowed in. At this rate, Britain would drain itself dry. The East India Company needed a solution. They found one. Opium. Beginning in 1773, the British East India Company established a monopoly on opium cultivation in Bengal. The plan was elegant in its cruelty. Grow opium in India, smuggle it to China, receive silver in payment, use that silver to buy tea, sell the tea in Britain. The trade balance would reverse. Silver would flow back to Britain, and China would pay for its own poisoning. The numbers tell the story. In 1729, 200 chests of opium reached China annually. By 1800, 4,500 chests. By 1833, 30,000 chests. By 1838, over 40,000 chests. Each chest contained roughly 140 pounds of opium. Britain was shipping nearly 3,000 tons of narcotics into China every year. The human toll was catastrophic. By the 1830s, an estimated 10% of the Chinese population was addicted. Some sources suggest the number reached as high as 33%. Government officials were not spared. 20% of central officials and 30% of local officials used opium regularly. Even the Daoguang emperor was reportedly an addict. An entire civilization was being systematically drugged to reverse the flow of silver. And it worked. By the 1820s, the trade balance had flipped. China was now paying silver for opium instead of receiving silver for tea and silk. Silver was draining out of the Chinese economy, causing deflation, unemployment, and social collapse. By 1839, opium sales to China paid for the entire British tea trade. The receipts show the crime clearly. This wasn't trade. This was financial warfare through mass addiction. In December 1838, the Daoguang emperor appointed a special commissioner to end the opium crisis. Lin Zexu arrived in Guangzhou on March 10, 1839. He announced, "If opium is not eradicated completely, this official will not return." He meant it. Lin arrested over 1,700 Chinese opium dealers. He confiscated 70,000 opium pipes. He blockaded the foreign trading houses and demanded that British merchants surrender their opium stocks. When they refused, he cut off their food and water. The merchants surrendered over 20,000 chests of opium, roughly 1,200 metric tons, worth more than 8 million taels of silver. Between June 3rd and June 25th, 1839, 500 laborers destroyed the entire stockpile. They mixed it with lime and salt and flushed it into the Pearl River. Lin wrote a letter to Queen Victoria. "We have heard that in your own country, opium is prohibited with the utmost strictness," he wrote. "You ought not to have the injurious drug transferred to another country." The letter probably never reached her. Some historians believe it was lost in transit. Others suspect it was deliberately suppressed. Either way, Britain's response was not diplomatic. It was military. In June 1840, British gunboats arrived on the Chinese coast. The official justification was protection of British property and subjects. The real reason was silver. China had tried to stop Britain's most profitable trade. Britain would force China to accept it. The war lasted 2 years. It wasn't close. British casualties numbered around 500. Chinese deaths reached 20 to 25,000. The Treaty of Nanking, signed August 29, 1842, extracted everything Britain wanted. $21 million in silver, $6 million for the destroyed opium, $3 million for debts, $12 million for war costs. Hong Kong ceded to Britain in perpetuity. 5 treaty ports opened to British trade. And critically, the treaty never mentioned opium. The drug trade continued, doubling to 60,000 chests annually by 1860. Britain had gone to war to protect drug trafficking, and won. The receipts exist, the treaty exists, the bodies were counted. This is financial crime number 3. 30 years later, on the other side of the world, another silver crime was being committed. This one was quieter, no gunboats, no opium. Just 67 sections of technical legislation and a provision buried where almost no one would notice. On February 12, 1873, President Ulysses S. Grant signed an act revising and amending the laws relative to the mints. The bill focused on mundane matters: mint organization, administrative procedures, nickel coinage specifications. But Section 15 listed the silver coins authorized for minting. The standard silver dollar was not on the list. With no debate and almost no public awareness, the United States had demonetized silver. The country had operated on a bimetallic standard since 1792. Both gold and silver were legal tender at a fixed ratio. Now, without announcement, silver dollars could no longer be minted. The U.S. was on a de facto gold standard. Western miners discovered the change only when they brought silver to the mint and were turned away. Farmers discovered it when deflation crushed crop prices and made their debts impossible to repay. By 1876, the backlash had begun. Congressman Richard Bland of Missouri, they called him Silver Dick, declared on the House floor, "The act of February 12, 1873 was a fraud. It was stealthily passed without reconsideration and without debate." Even Congressman William Kelly, who had introduced the bill, admitted, "I was ignorant of the fact it would demonetize silver." President Grant himself later wrote that he hadn't understood what he'd signed. Senator Henry Teller of Colorado gave the crime its name in 1890, the crime of 73. A story circulated for decades that a British banker named Ernest Said had arrived in America with 100,000 pounds, about $550,000, to bribe Congress into demonetizing silver. The theory made sense. British creditors held American bonds. Gold was scarcer than silver. A gold standard meant debtors would repay in more valuable currency. But the 1893 congressional investigation found no evidence. More damning, Ernest Said's actual letters to American congressmen pleaded for keeping the silver dollar. He was one of England's foremost advocates for silver, author of a 250-page book defending bimetallism. The man accused of killing silver had spent his career trying to save it. The conspiracy theory was wrong about the agent, but it was right about the crime. Someone benefited from silver's demonetization. Eastern bankers, bondholders, creditors of all kinds. And someone paid. Farmers who had borrowed when money was abundant and now repaid when money was scarce. Workers whose wages bought less every year. An entire generation crushed by deflation. The silver issue tore American politics apart for a generation. The Bland-Allison Act of 1878 forced the Treasury to buy $2 to $4 million of silver monthly. The Sherman Silver Purchase Act of 1890 increased purchases to 4.5 million ounces. Neither was enough. The Panic of 1893 triggered a depression. Treasury gold reserves plummeted. Silver advocates blamed the gold standard. Gold advocates blamed the silver purchases. Congress repealed the Sherman Act in 1893. Farmers were devastated. Then came Chicago, July 1896. The Democratic National Convention. A 36-year-old former congressman from Nebraska took the stage. William Jennings Bryan had been given a speaking slot in the debate on the party platform. What happened next became legend. "You come to us and tell us that the great cities are in favor of the gold standard," Bryan thundered. "I tell you that the great cities rest upon these broad and fertile prairies. Burn down your cities and leave our farms, and your cities will spring up again as if by magic. But destroy our farms, and the grass will grow in the streets of every city in the country." The crowd erupted, but Bryan wasn't finished. "Having behind us the producing masses of the nation and the world, we shall answer their demands for a gold standard by saying to them, 'You shall not press down upon the brow of labor this crown of thorns. You shall not crucify mankind upon a cross of gold.'" Bryan won the nomination that night. He lost the election to William McKinley. He ran again in 1900, lost again. Ran again in 1908, lost again. He accumulated 493 electoral votes across 3 campaigns, the most of anyone never elected president. The Gold Standard Act of 1900 made it official. Silver was finished as American money. The crime of 73 had won. Fast forward 80 years. When oil baron H. L. Hunt died in November 1974, he left his sons, Nelson Bunker Hunt and William Herbert Hunt, a fortune estimated at $2 to $3 billion. The brothers were worried. Nixon had ended the gold standard in 1971. Inflation was raging. The dollar was losing value every month. Gold ownership had been illegal for Americans since 1933. But silver wasn't. The Hunts started buying. In 1973, silver traded around $2 an ounce. The brothers bought 35 million ounces through futures contracts. In 1974, they acquired another 55 million ounces, roughly 9% of world supply. They chartered 3 Boeing 707s to fly 40 million ounces to Switzerland, guarded by armed Texas ranch hands. By 1979, they had partnered with Saudi investors and formed a company in Bermuda to continue accumulating. At their peak, the Hunts controlled approximately 100 million ounces of physical silver and another 90 to 150 million ounces in futures contracts. They owned 1/3 of the world's tradable silver supply. Silver started 1979 at $6.08 per ounce. By December, it had reached $34. On January 18, 1980, it hit $49.45 in London, $50.35 intraday on COMEX, a 713% increase in 12 months. The Hunts' holdings were worth over $4 billion on paper. They had spent only about $1 billion of their own money, using massive leverage. On March 26, 1980, Tiffany and Company took out a full-page advertisement in the New York Times. We think it is unconscionable for anyone to hoard several billion, yes, $1 billion worth of silver, and thus drive the price up so high that others must pay artificially high prices for articles made of silver. Tiffany's was making a public relations argument. The regulators were making a different calculation entirely. On January 7, 1980, COMEX implemented what they called Silver Rule 7. Position limits were slashed from 5,000 contracts to 2,000 per trader. Anyone holding more than 3 million ounces had to liquidate by February. On January 21st, the same day silver hit its all-time high, COMEX ordered liquidation-only trading. Investors could sell their positions. They could not buy new ones. The Hunts were frozen. They couldn't add to their position. They could only watch as the rules designed to stop them took effect. Federal Reserve Chairman Paul Volcker pressured banks to stop lending for commodities speculation. Credit to the Hunts vanished. March 27, 1980, Silver Thursday. Silver crashed from $21.62 to $10.80 in a single day, a 50% collapse. The Hunts couldn't meet their margin calls. They owed $1.7 billion they didn't have. If they defaulted, multiple brokerages and banks might collapse with them. Government officials feared systemic contagion. A consortium of banks arranged a $1.1 billion emergency credit line secured by Hunt family assets, including their stake in Placid Oil. The Hunts were bailed out to save the system. Then they were prosecuted. In 1988, a federal jury found them guilty of conspiracy to corner the silver market. Damages totaled $134 million. The CFTC fined each brother $10 million and banned them from commodities trading for life. Both brothers filed for bankruptcy later that year. Nelson Bunker Hunt, asked how it felt to lose $1 billion, reportedly replied, "$1 billion isn't what it used to be." The receipts show something else. Investigations later revealed that COMEX board members who voted for the rule changes held short positions in silver. They had bet that prices would fall. Then they voted for rules that made prices fall. The Hunts were prosecuted for trying to corner the market. The exchange members who changed the rules to protect their own short positions faced no consequences. Financial crime number 5. The rules exist to protect the house. March 2008. The financial crisis was accelerating. Bear Stearns collapsed. JPMorgan Chase acquired Bear Stearns for $2 a share, later raised to $10. Along with Bear's assets, JPMorgan inherited something else, the largest short position in silver on the COMEX. Former CFTC Commissioner Bart Chilton confirmed it on record. Bear had been short massive amounts of silver. That position transferred to JPMorgan. The combined position exceeded legal limits for a single trader. The CFTC granted JPMorgan a temporary waiver to reduce the position. Instead, JPMorgan increased it. Between March and October 2008, silver fell from $21 to $9 per ounce. For the next 8 years, JPMorgan traders would manipulate precious metals prices using a technique called spoofing. Spoofing is simple in concept. A trader places a large order they never intend to execute, say an order to sell 10,000 contracts. Other traders see the sell order and assume someone knows something. They start selling too. The price drops. The spoofer cancels their large sell order and instead buys at the lower price they just created. Then they reverse it, place a large buy order. Price rises as others follow. Cancel the buy order. Sell at the higher price. Repeat thousands of times. Harvest millions in profits. Leave everyone else trading against phantoms. The CFTC documented that JPMorgan traders placed hundreds of thousands of spoof orders in gold, silver, platinum, and palladium between 2008 and 2016. Hundreds of thousands, over 8 years, exposed only in 2020. Michael Nowak ran JPMorgan's Global Precious Metals Desk, managing director, the man in charge. Greg Smith was executive director and head gold trader. His nickname among prosecutors, the most prolific spoofer that the government has prosecuted to date. On August 10, 2022, a federal jury in Chicago convicted both men of fraud, attempted price manipulation, and spoofing. On August 22, 2023, the sentences came down. Nowak, 1 year and 1 day in federal prison, $35,000 fine. Smith, 2 years in federal prison, $50,000 fine. JPMorgan itself settled in September 2020. The total, $920,203,609. The CFTC confirmed it was the largest monetary penalty they had ever imposed. The breakdown, $436 million in civil penalties, $312 million in restitution to victims, $172 million in disgorgement of profits. 10 traders across 8 banks were eventually convicted. Total industry fines approached $1.3 billion for 8 years of systematic fraud affecting prices paid by miners, jewelers, manufacturers, and investors worldwide. One man had been calling out this manipulation since 1989. Ted Butler, an independent analyst, first contacted the U.S. Attorney General that year. For 3 decades, he identified concentrated short positions in CFTC data. He named JPMorgan as the primary manipulator after 2008. Regulators dismissed him. Industry insiders mocked him. The September 2020 settlement vindicated everything he'd alleged. Butler died in June 2024. He had spent 35 years fighting for this reckoning. The receipts finally came due. And now we arrive at the present. January 23rd, 2026, a Friday. Silver crossed $100 per ounce for the first time in recorded history. The spot price hit $100.49, with an intraday peak of $103.45. The journey to get here was extraordinary. In January 2025, silver traded around $29. By October, it had broken the 1980 Hunt Brothers record of $50. By December, it reached $83. Then, January 2026, $100. A 247% gain in 12 months. Why now? The silver market has run deficits for 5 consecutive years. In 2022, the shortage was 272 million ounces, the largest ever recorded. In 2023, 201 million ounces. In 2024, 149 million ounces. In 2025, another 100 million or more. Cumulative deficit since 2021, approximately 820 million ounces. Nearly an entire year of global production. Where is it going? Solar panels consumed over 19% of global silver demand in 2024. That share is rising toward 30 or 40% by 2030. Electric vehicles use 50 to 80% more silver than gasoline cars, sensors, wiring, battery connections. Artificial intelligence requires data centers. Each server cabinet needs roughly 1.2 kilograms of silver for computing hardware, electrical components, and cooling systems. Industrial demand is eating supply faster than mines can replace it, and the mines can't scale quickly. 75 to 80% of silver production is a byproduct of mining other metals. Lead, zinc, copper, gold. You can't just open a silver mine when prices rise. Silver comes out when base metal economics justify the operation. New mine development takes 7 to 10 years regardless of incentives. Supply is structurally capped. Demand is structurally rising. On January 1st, 2026, China implemented export controls on refined silver. Only 44 companies were approved to export. Requirements included minimum production of 80 tons annually and $30 million in credit lines. China controls 60 to 70% of the world's refined silver supply. These restrictions effectively weaponized that control. Silver was elevated to strategic material status, the same classification as rare earths. Elon Musk commented publicly, "This is not good. Silver is needed in many industrial processes." The impact on inventories has been severe. COMEX registered silver declined roughly 70% from 2020 levels. In December 2025, over 47 million ounces were claimed for delivery in just 4 trading days, more than 60% of total registered inventory. The Shanghai premium over COMEX reached $8 to $10 per ounce. Buyers in Asia were paying 10% above official prices just to get physical metal. Some analysts estimate the ratio of paper silver contracts to actual physical silver has reached 356 to 1. For every ounce of real silver, there are 356 ounces of promises. When everyone tries to collect on those promises at once, most will find there's nothing there. 6,000 years. That's how long humans have valued silver. Smelted it, mined it, traded it, fought over it, died for it. And in all that time, one pattern has repeated without exception. Every empire that tried to cheat silver eventually paid. Rome debased its coins for 2 centuries. The economy collapsed. The empire fell. Spain extracted more silver than any nation in history. It went bankrupt 6 times. Its industries withered. Its population declined. Britain reversed the silver flow by drugging an entire civilization. The blowback lasted a century. The Hunt brothers tried to corner the market. They lost everything. JPMorgan manipulated prices for 8 years. Their traders went to prison. Silver is not just a metal, it's a measuring stick. An honest measuring stick. You can print money, you can issue bonds, you can create derivatives and futures and options and swaps. But you cannot print silver. You can only dig it out of the ground 1 ounce at a time. When the measuring stick says your paper is worthless, you can suppress the message for a while. Change the rules, prosecute the messengers, manipulate the markets, but eventually the physical reality asserts itself. Eventually the receipts come due. On January 23rd, 2026, after decades of paper manipulation, after structural supply deficits, after China restricted exports and Russia started stockpiling and industrial demand overwhelmed mine production, silver broke $100. The poor man's gold, the people's money, the metal that funded democracy in Athens and destroyed empires in Rome and Spain, having its moment. The receipts were always kept. Now they're being called in. That's the complete history of silver. 6,000 years, 6 financial crimes, one metal that refuses to lie. If this changed how you think about money, subscribe. Share this with someone who needs to see it. The algorithm decides who finds this video. You decide whether the truth spreads. We don't have sponsors, we have you and the receipts.